Hello and Ram Ram. Welcome to the fifth video in the India by Explained series. Today we cover of Mandarin and masses. So it's been a while since the last upload and I apologize for it. I had a lot of work to do and found myself working pretty long hours. All of this led to a delay in the release of these videos. The upload schedule should return to normal from now on. Thank you for sticking by the channel and offering words of support. This chapter is quite easy to digest, but the insights it offers into how the minister frames India and its relationship with the world and the West are powerful. I hope you enjoy it. As always, if you enjoy my videos or find them helpful, hit the like and subscribe button. On to the video. The Indian street, that is ordinary people typically absent from the structures of power, has often displayed better instinct than Lutyens' Delhi on the matter of evaluating risks and opportunities abroad. The geopolitical understanding of this class of people may not be formal, but they are nonetheless intuitively able to judge whom to trade with and where to travel. The popular imagery of nations is captured in the complexity of diplomacy. The choices they make on emigration and education came much before larger policy level shifts undertaken by Indian diplomacy. They understood the implications of 9/11. All said and done, the street has a well-developed instinct about Russia or America or China or Pakistan. This does not mean that the carefully considered discussions of statecraft are less important than the passion of the street. It does not, however, take away from the fact that we live in an era where the availability of information, tools of technology, and cultural identities drive current-day nationalism. Another contribution to this process is the democratization of societies that has led to a politics that is more well-balanced and sensible. Due to this, the complexities of policy and the accumulated weight of experiences occasionally struggles to meet the demands of society, especially on topics where public opinion carries enormous sway. The challenge is to strike the right balance between societal forces and the mechanics of policy making. Quote, Mandarins can no longer be impervious to the masses. End quote. Mandarins are powerful officials or bureaucrats, usually senior bureaucrats. So the quoted statement says that those who sit at the top of India's foreign policy bureaucracy cannot stave off or keep away the influence of the masses. An inability to reconcile societal forces and the mechanics of policy making comes at the cost of political credibility, something seen in many other countries. India is not immune to this paradigm shift, a fundamental change in approach or underlying assumptions. The change in discourse within the country is indicative of a new age that has its own driving forces. Capturing Indian nationalism in terms of policy is a complex endeavor that needs to account for issues of history, identity, interests, and politics, all at the same time. The welfare of the Indian diaspora is also a part of this matrix. An associated question is how this relates to the West, the old order, and China. The end of history is one of the more arrogant assertions belonging to an era of hubris, an extremely smug statement. Its limitation as a Eurocentric analysis disregarded what was unfolding in Asia at the time it was pronounced. Quote, we were supposedly staring at a universal and invincible globalized order led by the US. End quote. However, what appeared as permanent was in fact a fleeting moment of American unipolarity, much like other powers in history before it. The world proceeded to return to a quote-unquote more natural diversity due to increased political competition and political arguments between countries. It was discovered that, like fashion, politics too has its cycles. We are witnessing a dramatic revival of nationalism across geographies after decades of being told that globalization was politically correct and economically inevitable. Some more subtle and gradual, others more unexpected and impactful. Each of them is different and specific to their society, yet part of a larger statement of cultural beliefs. Donald Trump may have overstated his case in September 2018 when he rejected globalism in favor of patriotism at the UN. The underlying reality, however, cannot be ignored. Stronger cultural identities and more nationalist narratives are the trend today, as seen in electoral outcomes across continents. In aspiration or in anxiety, we are seeing a return to history rather than an end to it. In places like China, this is an outcome of newly developed capabilities. But Russia, Turkey, and Iran all exercise influence despite a lack of objective difference in their circumstances. Nationalism appears to be the X factor in such situations. These trends are reflected in domestic debates where the loss of livelihood and identity is blamed on cosmopolitanism. How the concept of nationalism is perceived tells us much about a society. In the broader sense, the West has been less comfortable with nationalism than Asia. In the latter, it is regarded as a consequence of economic progress. This has started to change with the arrival of Trump. The history of a country helps explain why it may choose to shy away from nationalism, as in the case of Germany or Japan, or why it may choose to flaunt it, like Russia or Turkey. China is a latecomer to this game, having used it as a diplomatic tool for a while. However, for large parts of the developing world, especially those who won independence from colonial rule, nationalism is synonymous with asserting independence. Optimistic or not, different societies in different predicaments are choosing to walk down the path of nationalism as seen in the China Dream, Brexit, or America First. Quote, "The linkage between globalization, regime credibility, and a return to history is unmistakable." End quote. Nationalism has proven to be a durable, strong basis for the organization of societies. It has defeated conflicting ideologies of various shades, multinational empires, and subnationalism. Western imperialism was ended by the rise of nationalist sentiments in their colonies. Communism fell when socialism began to acquire national characteristics. The rift between the USSR and China, or China and Vietnam, are examples of how appealing nationalism is. Movements based on religion have also attempted to supersede national divisions. The causes of Palestine, Bosnia, and Afghanistan, or the rise of Daesh, which is ISIS, being the most prominent examples. They still falter before nationalism, given that they tend to be products of strong emotion and extraordinary circumstances. Globalization represents yet another attempt at supplanting national divides or overcoming national divides. It rests on the basis of technology more heavily than the movements that came before it, as well as strong economic interests. Due to this, there exists an obvious tension between it and nationalism, a tension that will continue for some time into the future. Disputes between these two powerful outlooks on the world is only natural. It therefore makes sense to see them as currents of history rather than events in history. Nationalism can be assertive, reactive, or expressive. A more confident form of nationalism is the outcome of a shift in the power hierarchy of the world, represented by the rise of countries like India and China, the continent of Asia, and the rebalancing of the global order. Evidence for this can be found in the content and character of international conversations, major conferences and negotiations, the perception of key world leaders, and formats such as G20 and BRICS. Other examples include the creation of new institutions such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the International Solar Alliance, as well as calls for fairer representation in bodies like the IMF and the UN. On the last point, China plays the role of the great disruptor since it cannot be accommodated in the old framework like Japan, South Korea, or the ASEAN countries. Quote, "The rise of India will only reinforce this pressure for change. For all their other differences, the demand for a more contemporary global order does put India and China on the same side of the table." End quote. The second factor driving the nationalist surge is the reaction of the quote, "more privileged societies," end quote, to the broader rebalancing that is playing out. Manufacturing offshoring, that is the relocation of manufacturing to different countries from your own, as well as the creation of vast supply chains, has led to resentment in the West. A resentment that has been made more intense by a perception that others have taken unfair advantage of the global trading system. Immigration to these countries also contributes to certain income groups in these countries feeling a sense of loss. Quote, ironically, the immediate crisis in Europe was sparked less by these happenings and more by refugees from conflict situations for which the West itself has responsibility. End quote. The outcome of this has been a mix of economic and cultural protectionism that has found momentum in political opinion. The third category has been the impact of distinct cultural identities across the world interacting with each other over time. West Asia has been an epicenter of this, with other regions reacting to it over time. Quote, there is a change in how people define themselves and perceive others. End quote. The broader identity constructs are now under challenge, with the balance between economics, politics, culture, faith, and identity seeing a disturbance. These trends will vary from country to country and possess its own dynamics. An uneasy coexistence and a shifting arrangement between globalist and nationalist forces is to be expected, as neither side can prevail over the other. Quote, and the world it will produce will be very contentious. End quote. India is not an exception to the factors that have strengthened nationalism. Ordinary citizens have strong feelings when it comes to national welfare and possible opportunities for India as a whole. The growth of the Indian economy and the emergence of an aspirational generation better connected to the world than previous ones fuel a process where Indians don't simply react to events such as the surgical strikes of Uri or Balakot or a border face-off, but also to issues such as membership of the nuclear suppliers group and elections to international bodies. India's power structure has broadened over the years that better captures the greater diversity of the country and reflects its strong roots. Nationalism contributes to a stronger sense of unity at an emotional level. At a political level, it manifests as a greater determination to combat subnational and supranational challenges to it. Supranational being power or influence transcending national boundaries or governments. At a policy level, it occupies itself with maximizing national capabilities and influence. Quote, a nationalistic foreign policy outlook is likely to approach the world with more confidence and greater realism. End quote. Where India breaks from many others is that its sense of nationalism does not translate into an us versus them mentality. This is because of our innate pluralism as well as tradition of reconciling nationalism with global engagement. Quote, it has the potential to serve as a bridge between the established and emerging orders. End quote. Politics and identity creates nationalism in many ways. India has had to deal with both in its immediate neighborhood. Its civilizational influence is not limited by contemporary political boundaries. New nationalisms, however, are not always open to building on old connections. Due to this, India's interaction with its immediate areas as well as more extended ones was significantly diluted. The challenge as a result is to, quote, rebuild a fractured region while re-establishing linkages beyond. The two goals can be self-supporting if both processes go well, or much harder if either stumble. End quote. A shared history and divided sociology has made for natural sensitivity when it comes to South Asia. A caution and to some degree suspicion is therefore visible at times, especially when it comes to elite attitudes. This must be resolved as India builds understanding with societies as a whole. It would offer greater incentives for close cooperation and provide reassurance. India should show that its prosperity is a lifting tide for the region. This will involve allocating more resources and attention as captured by the Neighbourhood First policy. India cannot escape its neighbours and therefore the challenges that come with such neighbours. To this end, in order to mitigate such situations, India should invest in greater structural interlinkages to keep relationships steady. The easier way to understand this is to think of creating an atmosphere where our neighbours are enmeshed into our systems. That is, create a condition where breaking away from Indian influence is harder due to how wedded the two countries are to each other at a structural level. Quote, "It is also important that where there are real problems, we do not duck them. Generosity and firmness must go hand in hand." End quote. Over the past few years, India has defined its interests with clarity and trusted its own instincts. This has led it to become a center of crystallization of global opinion when it comes to the region. India has also responded positively to those neighbors who have engaged India more intensively. India's view of the world is expansive at a time when most others are pursuing their interests more narrowly. Stepping forward in difficult situations will help convince countries that India does indeed possess greater capabilities and confidence than it did in the past. It will also help India build its unique brand as a generous power. This thinking reinforces India's positioning as a power that is able to bridge divides. The approach has been in the making over the last few years, from responding to natural calamities to first responder in crisis situations to its stance of respecting international law and norms. Quote, "Nationalism, contributing to global good, is powerful for brand building." End quote. The modern world functions in large part within a framework made of Western norms and concepts. Looking to history as a guide, it should come as little surprise then that as nationalism rises across geographies, Westernization will be impacted. Even in Asia, where economic rise and cultural confidence are seen as linked, the picture becomes more complex when compromises and assertions are discussed. Running a comparison between India, China, and Japan brings out where these societies have adapted and where they have held on to their traditions. Among all of the factors one could use to color the relationship with the West, either as an easy or difficult one, the most decisive has been the political factor. Though these societies have calculated and re-evaluated their relationship with the West through every stage of their modernization, their nationalist expressions are going to be difficult to keep contained as Asia makes its influence felt in the global arena. From starting off with political assertions that were limited in nature to broad societal and historical statements in the present, Asia has come a long way. It is hard to predict how far these brand building exercises will develop and what their impact will be on finding common ground globally. While the Chinese invoke the century of humiliation to justify their current decisions, if anyone should be complaining, it should be India, a country that saw 2 centuries of the R word I can't say on YouTube and pillaging by Europe. Quote, "This despoiling of a leading economy of its times is still to be widely appreciated. A 2018 study estimated that the resources drained from India by the UK alone were as much as $45 trillion by current value." End quote. The minister asserts that these numbers highlight the scale of the systematic looting that Western narratives underplay. The evidence is before us all to observe. Despite this, imperialism has produced a history that has been embraced in many quarters in today's day and age. A history that states that British rule was somehow beneficial to Indians. Quote, "The real record, of course, is of creating poverty, opium trade, slavery, and famine on a mass scale. Remorse over this dark chapter of history is limited even now. Instead, glorification of this era remains the primary narrative as museums continue to proudly display artifacts that do not belong to them." End quote. It is remarkable then that despite a growing awareness of these depredations, Indians hold few to no grudges. What set India apart from China of the 1950s, 60s or Japan of the 1930s is that it never resorted to whipping up the masses into a frenzy on the basis of anti-Western sentiment. The largely non-frictional but not always cordial history of Indo-Western ties is worthy of note. Once India decided to set history to one side and let politics take the hot seat, a convergence on values and interests began to be observed. India and the West did share a liberal democratic political model, similar governance practices, a credible market economy, and commitment to the rule of law after all. India choosing to continue maintaining close ties with the English-speaking world post-independence was a decision that was extremely important. Over the years since, a relationship spanning politics, security, trade, investment, services, innovation, education and development assistance blossomed, especially with the US and UK. Extensive contacts between civil societies and institutions characterized this phase. The Indian diaspora in Western societies aided in strengthening the bond. The West has been a source of critical military and economic support at challenging moments in India's contemporary history. Take the 1960s. After the border conflict with China and the years of famine, India received developmental assistance from multilateral banks controlled by Western nations. When India decided upon reforms 30 years ago, shifting to higher growth rates, the West was once again found being supportive of India's trajectory. The West has shown its support by advancing Indian political interests in the international system, manifested via the Indo-US nuclear deal and membership of various export control regimes. Since 9/11, the relationship between the West and India has made itself especially felt. Be it terrorism, maritime security or connectivity, there is a strong meeting of minds. When it comes to economic partnerships, sources of capital, technology and best practices central to India's modernization, the European Union, the UK and the US are among the top players. The politics of these ties has kept pace. Maturing ties is now leading to a two-way flow where Indian companies are emerging as significant foreign investors in Western economies. The Indo-US relationship is one that has blossomed in recent years, while the third option on strategic issues that Europe has long been seen as has grown in importance. The effect of these developments has created a high degree of comfort between India and the West. While appreciating the state of ties today, we must not overlook where the state of the relationship once was. An honest account would begin with partition, an event that severely diminished India's influence. The artificial twinning of India with Pakistan, a deliberate creation, was smashed only in 1971. Quote, "There was also for many years an interest in politically exploiting fissures within Indian society. The latitude extended even today to separatist activities citing democratic freedoms is troubling." End quote. Up until recently, the West often chose to associate with political forces that sought, quote-unquote, greater distance from India. If India's democratic values are being extolled today, it is important to remember that this was not always the case. Au contraire, military regimes were held up as examples of efficiency in the past. There was an approach that sought to simultaneously keep India in play while also checking it. Quote, "An unstable or weak India was as undesirable as a strong and domineering one. It was, in truth, a Goldilocks approach to the Indian porridge. Not too hot, nor too cold, needing some effort to get it just right. And this was the India policy of most Western foreign offices." End quote. This is why one observes the paradox of assistance when India was down after the War of 1962 and of opposition when India asserted itself during the War of 1971. The in-between phases are of cautious steady engagement. There was a sense of wariness when it came to aspirations of industrialization, building defense, nuclear or space capabilities, or attaining positions of international influence even when there was broad support for India's development. A lot of this was rationalized using the argument of India with its policy of non-alignment, not siding with the West during the Cold War. Quite understandably, the India narrative is a sea apart, and a Western partiality for Pakistan is seen as the reason for India's drift towards the Soviet bloc. Quote, "All of this has, however, substantially changed, and with it, really, India's relationship with Western nations as a whole and its key players in particular." End quote. On a whole host of different social and economic issues, India diverges significantly from Western interests. The issues are often policies that affect the lives of millions. trade, climate change, and intellectual property being some of the areas that see divergence. India also speaks for a large group of developing nations insofar as equity and fairness is concerned. Both India and the West will try to frame issues and set priorities to its advantage, which will result in these contradictions continuing. Quote, India has a powerful constituency in the global south that it must cultivate even as it rises. It would be a more southwestern power than the West may desire. End quote. When it comes to security and politics, India sometimes finds itself being the victim of the collateral damage of Western initiatives. Case in point, the Afghan Jihad of the 1980s. America's support via Pakistan for the Afghan Jihad ended up fueling terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. Developments in Afghanistan and West Asia is a topic of concern for India even today. When the viewpoint is not the same, perceptions and priorities can also differ significantly. Quote, on nuclear proliferation, the Western focus on Iran and North Korea stands out in contrast to the whitewashing of Pakistan and the fairy tale of a private AQ Khan network. On the question of civil liberties and human rights, a military regime to India's east in Myanmar was sanctioned at the very time when one to its west in Pakistan was hailed as an ally. When it came to the great tragedies of our era, whether it is the famine in China or mass killings in Bangladesh and Cambodia, strategic calculations of the West trumped public outrage. Old habits explain why the countries that contribute troops to UN peacekeeping have little say in the mandates, or that the bombing of an Air India aircraft off Ireland is treated so differently from that of Pan Am over Lockerbie 4 years later. We have seen societies that overlook advocacy of terrorism in the name of free speech, then practice rendition when their own security is at stake. End quote. India and the West both have lessons to draw from these examples. India should avoid underestimating the influence the West still retains in the world. The West, for its part, should learn to appreciate that India comes from a different place and a different history. Some divergences will remain even as common ground expands. The set of institutions and practices the West established, progressively but firmly, in the period of its dominance has proved to be the basis of Western durability up to now. There is virtually no domain that is not in some form shaped or regulated by these institutions. Rules are set for the entire world and global commons, natural systems and resources such as oceans that do not belong to any one country. This is supported by narratives that serve Western interests well but diminish those of its competitors. Quote, the mix of institutions, regimes, regulations and understandings is such a complex web that creating alternatives is truly a formidable challenge. However, as global power redistribution progresses, this will inevitably happen. End quote. Entrenched powers compromising with emerging powers also raises questions of which powers to compromise with, as well as the extent and nature of the compromise. When it comes to China, the West has used mutual economic gain as the logic for its engagement. The stresses today are an indication that the mutuality of this logic has come under scrutiny. India is a different case altogether. This is because there is a political layer sitting atop the economic logic. India's pluralistic character and democratic outlook is close to that of the West. As a result, India's present economic growth and political stature is imbued with greater significance. Contributing to India's rise can be a part of the West's contribution to shaping a new global strategic balance. India, for its part, would do well in remembering that historically, quote, some nations have been partnered by others, reflecting a larger calculus, end quote. It is not simply a matter about India's growing capabilities. The relative weight of the West is also changing. Quote, if the US specifically and the West as a whole has lost its edge, that is due to its miscalculations on political Islam and China respectively. Added to that are problems emanating from economic, social, demographic and political trends that have been long in the making. End quote. When it comes to rising nationalism and insularity in the West, social trends have been a driving factor. The anti-globalization narrative is fueled by a combination of immigration and policies promoting income disparity. Quote, as cultural nationalism spiked, the West also turned on itself, the UK on Europe and the US on its alliance commitments. End quote. In Europe, there has been a sustained global cutback in the wake of the Eurozone crisis. Europe has chosen to withdraw politically from Asia and defines its interests in primarily economic terms. However, the pace of change seen in the last decade has meant that it found itself on the defensive on its home turf. The comfort provided by the Atlantic Alliance has also come into question. The broad picture is that of turmoil and disarray. The gaps between the US and Europe on a range of issues are now visible even as Europe itself stands divided after years of promoting internal unity. Matters have gotten to a point where the very idea of a cohesive Western world seems untenable. The US was the glue that bound this framework. As it turns inward, the framework is threatening to come unstuck. We may therefore be seeing an emerging multipolarity within the West. When such a West engages India, or when India engages such a West, it is going to be different from the times when the West solidarity was stronger. India has a long road ahead of it despite being a rising power. It can look to contemporary history for lessons to make this journey easier. The most impressive growth stories of the last 150 years have all involved the West, be it the Soviet Union in the 1920s, Japan in the 19th century, and after the 1950s, South Korea in the 1960s, ASEAN in the 1970s, and China in the 1980s. China took a double risk and enjoyed the double benefit of first siding with the USSR in the 1950s and then switching to the West in the 1980s. The West will have its own agenda when it comes to helping, but this shouldn't be a turn-off. The challenge is to utilize them as an option and handle the consequences. Globalization, currently under stress, will remanifest itself in a revised form. For India, a stronger partnership with the West will lead to political and economic gains as well as opportunities in technology applications and human resource optimization. This will naturally be balanced by Indian interests in areas of disagreement. While a combination of economics, technology and demographics will make the Indo-Western relationship stronger, the real difference will be made by politics and values. For this, India and the West must fit into each other's scheme of the world. While thinking of India's growth as a strategic development in the larger Western interest is something that finds acceptance in the US and Japan, it is yet to be fully welcomed in Europe. From an economic perspective for the West, India's rapid emergence as a source of greater global demand and supply will help reduce excessive dependence on one single geography, especially as the world moves towards a greater reliance on technology. Resource and cost optimization remaining guiding principles of business, the importance of India's human resources to the global economy will only grow with time. Responsible governance and its market economy make India a safe partner insofar as contract designing and manufacturing is concerned. For the West, India's success will help affirm the belief that democratic politics and high-growth economics are not mutually exclusive. Quote, India's multi-faith society is also an enormous contribution to global stability. In fact, that is what acts as a firewall, preventing the spread of fundamentalism and radicalism from India's west to its east. End quote. India is making important contributions to maritime security in the Indian Ocean and building connectivity in Asia. India's participation strengthens export control regimes dealing with sensitive technologies. India's presence adds to the credibility of various global initiatives and negotiations and helps in settling on outcomes. Quote, for a Western system that must reinvent itself to stay strong, it is a good option to partner. End quote. For all this to work, a number of relationships need to fall into place, such as the Indo-US, UK, Europe, and Japanese relationships. With the US, India has cemented ties continuously with successive administrations in the recent past. Quote, the way forward has been to find commonality that resonates. With Clinton, it was pluralism and business. With Bush, it was democracy and global strategy. And with Obama, climate change and radicalization. Following Trump's election, it is bilateralism, trade, and security convergences. It is to India's advantage that an American president is less a prisoner of those regimes and orthodoxies that have long blocked progress with a newer partner. In the Trump vision of the world, allies have disappointed America and competitors have cheated it. India is fortunate in being neither. End quote. The Indo-American relationship is the heart of the overall Indo-Western relationship. The British had a significant role in crafting larger policy in the early stages, due to which post-partition considerations carried over into foreign policy positions. As time passed, American interests moved away from this paradigm, just as Indian interests in the East began to grow. Even today, the difference in convergences east and west of India are visible. How much they diminish will determine larger Western closeness to India. Efforts to expand Indo-US ties have yielded results. Quote, "The breadth of contacts and the ease of conversations now would not have been imaginable a decade and a half ago. The strength of the relationship can veritably be measured in G2G, B2B, P2P, or even T2T, technology to technology terms. A country that did not buy any military equipment for 4 decades operates multiple platforms now. Societal contact has been especially strong, underpinned by the large presence of Indian students. Public sentiment in both nations is very positive, and the Indian diaspora has become an extraordinary bridge that has impacted the US Congress in particular." End quote. The Indo-US relationship also has its challenges as a result of diverging geopolitical perspectives and domestic compulsions. Frictions on trade and concerns on mobility are perhaps top of the list today. There is also the issue of needing to continuously tend to the relationship. Quote, "India has to maintain a narrative in the US of its value, whether it is in terms of geopolitics, shared challenges, market attractions, technology strengths, or burden sharing. And it must be customized for the president of the day. Given the discontinuity in American policy, it is also important that their engagement continuously factors in the updated priorities and the issues that emerge from them." End quote. The world is different, but the fundamentals have not yet been upended completely. Asia has seen an impressive rise, and the West has yielded economic and political space. To discount the West, however, would be a serious folly. So too would be suggesting that growing Asian GDPs rapidly translate into strategic influence. Quote, "The fact is that right now the major markets are still in the West, as in fact is the capital needed for growth. More importantly, the West continues to be the main source of technology and innovation, even if its leads are eroding. Global institutions are anchored in its mores as standards are largely set there. The global commons are largely regulated by the West, and its invisible influence is perhaps even more potent than its visible form." End quote. Declarations of the West's demise are premature. Defense budgets in the world are dominated by Western expenditure, even if the US is excluded. Look at the wars fought in the last 25 years. Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Causes and results aside, the Western will to use force, great improvements in technology and its application, and a pronounced ability to apply political pressure have all been made evident. The US and Europe are still the leading suppliers of military and dual-use technologies. The West has a presence in large parts of the world and are quick to respond when Western interests are threatened. Unsurprisingly, they are the principal intermediaries in any regional negotiation. Iraq in 2003, Afghanistan after 1979, and Western actions in India's immediate neighborhood have made part of the case for caution when it comes to the way the Indo-Western relationship is pursued. This, however, is a legacy issue as India rises in a structurally loose world. India was weaker then. Quote, "What may have held true in the 1950s when India chose to be non-aligned is perhaps less so today. Maintaining that the risks have not changed since then is to dismiss the considerable achievements that India has to its record since the 1990s. It is also to underplay India's visibly improved standing in the world." End quote. When it came to make or break issues like CTBT or TRIPS, India drew a hard line in the past. Today, India has the ability to work confidently with the West when required and differ when Indian interests demand. India has not hesitated in charting its own course in regions like Africa. It has also been able to influence the international community and shown the ability to take positions in regards to the immediate neighborhood. Quote, "This may make it uncomfortably independent at times, but still a partner that has growing value in a more multi-axial world." End quote. When looking to the future with confidence, Indians should not forget that the journey ahead has obstacles of history to overcome. Despite making substantial contributions to both world wars, India was not seated at the high table in 1945, something it continues to pay the price for even today. There is talk of a more contemporary world order, but the fact of the matter is that the entrenched powers refuse to give up their privileges even if it means a more dysfunctional international system. Practices and regimes derived from 1945 affect India negatively, be it the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or, till recently, representation in the International Court of Justice. Quote, "Questioning the 1945 order is important, but a task to be handled with considerable delicacy. It should be done with a forward-looking perspective that would appeal to the decolonized world, rather than be seen as a backward step that reverses historical outcomes. As India goes up in the international order, it will advance its own narratives and, on occasion, question Western ones." End quote. Through its actions and messaging, India has patiently created a narrative of the country being a responsible democratic power. As India begins to define itself more clearly, there are bound to be more arguments and adjustments. At the end of the day, it will all be about rebalancing given the role of nationalism in global affairs. In closing, I leave you with the minister's words. Quote, "At the core of a contemporary compact with the West is the need for an appreciation of the changes in our country. This will require an acceptance that an elite created in a Western mold has now outlived its relevance. Looking beyond orthodoxies is more widely accepted now, and the Munich Security Conference 2020 tellingly focused on Westlessness. For its part, India must make the most of this concern while developing a nuanced understanding of the Western world. It is now values and strategy that could bring India and the West together rather than habits and culture. How effectively that would happen will be one of the factors shaping the global landscape." End quote. Well, that's all folks. Thank you for taking the time to see my video through. Please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.